Korean Mafia boss raised Mistress's son as heir. On Successor Day, his real triplets arrived, DNA proof. He raised another man's son for 25 years, placed him at the head of a criminal empire worth billions, and called him blood, while his real sons grew up in the Swiss Alps eating boarding school porridge, not knowing their father was the most feared man in Seoul. The jade ring was inches from Ji-hoon's undeserving fingers when the doors opened. Some betrayals don't just sting, they detonate. The penthouse sat 62 floors above Seoul like a throne balanced on a sword's edge, and this morning, everyone inside it was pretending they weren't afraid. That was the first lie of Successor Day. The second lie was Ji-hoon's face, composed, rehearsed, wearing the expression of a man born to inherit power rather than a man who had spent the last 3 weeks practicing it in the mirror of his Gangnam apartment. He stood to the right of his father's mahogany chair in a suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. His jaw set, his eyes forward, his hands, if you look closely enough, trembling at the knuckles like a fault line about to give. Kang Dae-jung noticed the hands. He noticed everything. He had built an empire on noticing things other men dismissed as irrelevant. The wrong pause in a sentence, the wrong smile at the wrong moment. The way a loyal man's eyes moved differently from a lying man's. He built a legend on that precision. It was, therefore, one of history's more spectacular ironies that the one lie he had never caught was the one sleeping under his own roof. The dragon sat on his chair. Nobody called it a throne out loud, but nobody called it anything else in their heads. Dressed in a charcoal suit with a single red pocket square, the color of blood worn casually, the way only men who've seen enough of it can manage. 61 years old, silver threading through black hair, eyes the temperature of deep ocean water. He surveyed the room the way a man surveys something he built from ash and sheer violent will, which is to say, with the quiet, terrifying satisfaction of someone who has never once doubted the price he paid. Around the room, the syndicate's inner circle arranged themselves with the practiced casualness of people who wanted very badly to look relaxed. 12 men, 4 women, each one worth more than a mid-sized nation's annual GDP, each one watching Ji-hoon with the polite, hungry attention of people deciding whether to invest or devour. Minhee stood near the east window, and she was magnificent in the way expensive traps are magnificent, deliberately, technically, without a single wasted detail. 52 years old, though the best surgeons in Apgujeong had rendered that number largely theoretical. She wore ivory, strategic, the color of victory dressed as innocence. Her smile had been loaded and cocked since 5 a.m. This was the morning she had spent 25 years engineering. This was the moment Ryu Sung-min had planted her for. And in approximately 12 minutes, the jade ring would leave the silver tray and slide onto her son's finger, and the dragon's empire would quietly, elegantly, completely belong to Pusan. She had to admit, even privately, that it was a beautiful plan. It had the clean lines of a masterpiece. It had patience. Ryu had always understood that the most devastating weapon isn't a gun. It's a woman with a mission, a forged DNA test, and 2 decades of undetected access. Nobody in this room knew any of that, of course. That was rather the point. Elena moved through the room like water, present everywhere, visible to no one. This was her particular genius, the one she had cultivated across 20 years of service in the dragon's household. The ability to be in the room while everyone behaved as if the room were empty. Maids are furniture to powerful people, which is a catastrophic miscalculation that powerful people make with astonishing consistency. She was tall, composed, dark-skinned, with the kind of bearing that in any other context would mark her immediately as someone who gives orders rather than takes them. She carried the silver tray with the jade ring. She had been carrying it for 40 minutes, waiting for the ceremony to begin, and her hands had not moved a millimeter. If her pulse was elevated, nothing in her posture confirmed it. She was the stillest person in the room, and she was the only one who knew exactly what was about to happen. Her eyes moved, briefly once, to the large oak doors at the room's north end. Closed. For now. She had left the service entrance at the building's east side unlocked at 7:43 this morning. The 3 letters had gone out to Switzerland 8 weeks ago. The rest, as they say, was not yet history, but it was about to be. Dae-jung raised one hand, and the murmur in the room fell to immediate silence. This was another thing that separated the real from the performed. A man who has actual authority never has to raise his voice. The room simply adjusts. Ji-hoon had been practicing the raised hand too, but when he did it, people finished their sentences. "We begin," the dragon said. Ji-hoon stepped forward. The syndicate leaned in. Minnie's smile sharpened by a precise, invisible degree. Elena's eyes moved back to the oak doors. And then, right then, in the specific silence between one world ending and another beginning, the doors came off their hinges. Not literally, but close enough that 3 members of the security detail actually reached for weapons before their brains caught up with their hands and told them to stop, look, think. 3 men walked through the door, and the room did not gasp. The room simply stopped, the way a city stops when the ground moves beneath it, that suspended half-second before anyone understands what has happened. Because standing in the light of the entrance, wearing the dragon's face across 3 identical bodies, were the sons Kang Dae-jung had sent to the mountains to survive a world that wasn't ready for them. It appeared the world had run out of time to get ready. Minhee's ivory dress suddenly looked less like victory and more like a surrender flag, and she hadn't even processed why yet. Elena looked at the silver tray in her hands. The jade ring caught the light. Right on time, she thought. The 3 men did not rush. That was the detail that broke people first, not the faces, not the jawlines that were basically photocopied from the man sitting on the mahogany throne, not even the audacity of walking into the most dangerous room in Seoul uninvited. It was the pace. They walked the way their father walked, unhurried, deliberate, with the quiet confidence of men who understood that urgency is a costume worn by people who aren't sure they'll win. The syndicate inner circle, 12 men and 4 women who had collectively ordered more violence than a small war, stood completely still and said absolutely nothing. This was remarkable. These were not people who were easily silenced. These were people who had once continued a board meeting while a rival's building burned 3 blocks away, pausing only to note the smoke as a mild inconvenience to the view. But this required a moment. The lead triplet, the one in the center, the one who walked half a step ahead of his brothers the way the oldest always does, even when nobody assigned the role, scanned the room with obsidian eyes that were so precisely Kang Dae-jung's that 2 of the syndicate members actually looked at the boss to confirm he was still sitting down and hadn't somehow multiplied. He had. He was. He sat perfectly motionless in his chair, and his expression had done something it almost never did in public. It had cracked. Not collapsed. Not shattered. Just cracked. A fault line running through the ice. The dragon was staring at 3 young men who wore his bone structure, his height, his stillness, his particular brand of dangerous calm, and somewhere behind his eyes something ancient and buried was clawing toward the surface, with the desperation of a man who has been holding his breath for 25 years without knowing it. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, curled once, then stilled. Minhee recovered faster than anyone gave her credit for, because Minhee had not survived 25 years of living in the dragon's shadow by being slow. Her brain processed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. Unknown men, identical faces, wrong timing, catastrophic implications, and arrived at the only play available to her: aggression dressed as outrage. "Who are these people?" she demanded, and her voice came out magnificently steady, which was a performance deserving of a standing ovation given that her entire cardiovascular system was currently attempting to exit her body through her chest. "Guards, remove them. Now." Nobody moved. This was new. Minhee had been issuing instructions in this penthouse for 2 decades, and people had always moved. The stillness that answered her was a specific quality of silence, the kind that arrives when a room collectively realizes that the person speaking no longer has the authority they think they have, and everyone is waiting to see if she'll figure that out on her own. She would not figure it out gracefully. Ji-hoon, to his credit, attempted to take a step forward. It was meant to be authoritative. It landed somewhere closer to a man trying to walk on a boat in rough water. Technically forward motion, but not exactly inspiring. "You're interrupting a private ceremony," he said, aiming for his father's register and landing about 2 octaves too high. "I don't know who sent you, but sit down." 2 words. From the lead triplet, quiet as a blade being unsheathed. Ji-hoon sat down. He would later tell himself he chose to. The room would remember differently. The lead triplet reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a thick manila folder. He crossed the room at that same unhurried pace, and the syndicate parted for him the way water parts for something moving with absolute certainty of its direction. He reached the mahogany table and set the folder down, not slammed, not tossed, set, With the precise, controlled placement of a man who has rehearsed this moment in his head across 8 weeks of transatlantic preparation and is determined to execute it with the dignity it deserves. The folder slid across the wood on its own momentum and stopped directly in front of Kang Dae-jung. DNA results, Father, the triplets said. Validated by 3 independent laboratories in Zurich, London, and Seoul. Cross-referenced and certified. Every page notarized. He paused. Your heir is the biological son of Ryu Sung-min. We are your blood. The name landed in the room like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Ryu Sung-min. Busan. The ports. The 15-year war of attrition that had never broken the dragon's empire, but had never fully stopped trying. The rival who smiled at every summit meeting and whose handshakes all came with a second agenda tucked in the palm. That name, in this room, at this moment, with those 3 faces standing in evidence, the arithmetic was simple and it was catastrophic. Someone had reached inside the dragon's house and rearranged his entire bloodline. Dae-jung did not reach for the folder immediately. He sat with the information the way he sat with everything, letting it settle, letting the weight of it find its true measure, refusing to react before he understood. This was the discipline that had kept him alive through 4 assassination attempts, 2 syndicate coups, and 1 particularly ambitious tax investigation by a prosecutor who had subsequently retired early under circumstances nobody discussed. His eyes moved from the folder to the triplets, across all 3 faces. Then, slowly, with the precise calculation of a man confirming a truth he already knew in his bones but had not permitted himself to name, his gaze settled on Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon, who looked nothing like him. Ji-hoon, whom he had loved anyway because grief is indiscriminate and lonely, men are not careful. Ji-hoon, who was currently sweating through a 40,001 suit shirt and trying to decide between running and fainting and achieving neither. Then Dae-jung's eyes moved to Elena. She stood exactly where she had stood since the ceremony began, the silver tray in her hands, the jade ring catching light, her expression giving away precisely nothing. But when his gaze found hers, she gave him one thing, a single, slow, deliberate nod. Yes, I knew. I found it. I fixed it. You're welcome. 20 years of service, and that nod contained all of it. Min-hee watched the exchange and felt, for the first time in her adult life, the specific physical sensation of a plan failing. It moves through you differently than fear. Fear is loud. This was quiet. This was the sound of 25 years of architecture collapsing floor by floor, with impeccable, terrible efficiency. This is fabricated, she said, and even she could hear that the word had lost its spine. They're imposters. Ryu sent them. Can't you see? This is exactly what he would do. Manufacture a... Min-hee, Dae-jung's voice. Quiet. Final. The temperature of the room dropped 3 degrees. She stopped talking. He opened the folder. The first page was a laboratory header from Zurich. Dae-jung read it the way he read everything. Completely, without expression, absorbing each line with the focused patience of a man who had learned decades ago that reacting before you finish reading is how empires fall. The room held its breath with the collective restraint of people who understood, instinctively, that they were watching something private happening in public, and that interrupting it would be the last interesting decision they ever made. The DNA report was 43 pages long. He read every one. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Min-hee stood by the window and performed composure so aggressively it had looped back around into its own kind of confession. Ji-hoon had stopped, pretending to be authoritative, and was now simply existing in his chair with the grim, hollow energy of a man watching his biography get rewritten in real time. The syndicate members had collectively decided that the most intelligent thing they could do was become temporarily invisible, which, for 12 people in an enclosed room, was ambitious but admirable. The triplets waited. This was perhaps the most striking thing about them, the waiting. They had crossed continents for this moment, had spent 8 weeks after the first anonymous letter arriving in a Swiss dormitory, reading it 3 times, calling each other into the same room, and standing in silence before the eldest said, "We go." They had spent those weeks gathering additional evidence, coordinating, preparing. They had rehearsed for confrontation, for shouting, for denial, for chaos. They had not prepared for this. For their father reading 43 pages in complete silence, while a room full of the underworld's most dangerous people stood around him like students waiting for a grade. But they held their positions with the stillness they had inherited from a man they had never met, and a country they had left before they could form memories of it, carrying a face that had followed them their entire lives in mirrors and in each other's eyes, without ever having a name to put to it, until 8 weeks ago. The eldest, Kang Jae-won, though the room didn't know his name yet, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. To his left, Kang Jae-min watched their father with an expression balanced precisely between hope and the studied refusal to hope. The particular emotional posture of someone who has been disappointed by the idea of family before and isn't prepared to be foolish about it twice. To the right, Kang Jae-seo, the quietest of the three, had not taken his eyes off Elena since the moment they entered. He recognized her, not her face. He had been an infant when she last saw him. But the letter, the third anonymous letter, the one that had included a photograph tucked behind the formal documentation, a photograph of the penthouse garden, taken from a high window, with a small handwritten arrow pointing at a figure in the corner. Tall, composed, carrying a tray. The note beneath it had said only, "She kept your mother's memory alive when everyone else buried it. Trust her." He had trusted her before he'd trusted the DNA results. Dae-jung reached the final page. He closed the folder with both hands, pressing it flat against the table, as if the gesture could contain what was inside it. Then he sat back and stared at the ceiling, briefly, privately, in the manner of a man asking a question of the heir that the heir will not answer. 25 years. Soo-yeon had been gone for 23 of them. The thought of her arrived now with the particular cruelty of perfect timing. She had sent their sons away to protect them, had died before she could bring them back, and he had filled the silence she left with a woman who was, it now emerged, a weapon pointed at everything Soo-yeon had loved. If there was a god operating the machinery of irony, he had an exceptionally dark sense of humor. The dragon stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. He simply rose from the chair, and somehow the act of it rearranged the entire gravity of the room. The syndicate straightened. The guards adjusted. Ji-hoon flinched. Min-hee went very, very still in the particular way that prey animals go still when they've run out of places to run. Dae-jung walked around the table. He crossed the room at his characteristic pace, unhurried, inevitable, and stopped in front of Ji-won. He was looking at his own face, younger, unweathered, carrying none of the damage the years had deposited on his own features. His son looked back at him with those obsidian eyes, and did not look away, and did not step back, and did not offer him anything easy. Good. He hadn't raised them, but whatever they were his. He turned to Jae-min. The same assessment. Then Jae-seo, who met his gaze with a directness that almost made the dragon smile, which was an expression so rare in this room that it would have caused genuine alarm. Then Dae-jung turned around. He faced the room. 12 syndicate members, 4 women, 1 disgraced mistress, 1 fraudulent heir. And when he spoke, his voice had none of the warmth it had briefly threatened to contain. It was back to what it always was. Bedrock. Iron. The voice of a man who has never once in his adult life said anything he didn't mean. Min-hee. She lifted her chin. She was still performing. She was extraordinary, actually. A lesser woman would have already broken, would have run or collapsed or reached for a phone. She stood there in her ivory dress with her chin up and her eyes hard, and her hands betraying her with the faintest tremor at her sides. "You have 30 seconds, he said, to tell me whether Ryu Sung-min sent you or whether you found your way to him on your own." The distinction mattered. It was the difference between being a weapon and being a traitor. Both were fatal, but one of them was personal. Min-hee opened her mouth, closed it, and in that gap, that brief, fatal hesitation, she answered the question more completely than any words could have. Dae-jung nodded once, the way a man nods when arithmetic confirms what instinct already told him. He looked at Ji-hoon, who had gone the particular shade of pale that has no name in any language because it only appears on the faces of people watching everything end. "Get out of my chair," the dragon said quietly. "You were never supposed to be in it." And Ji-hoon, son of Ryu Sung-min, heir to nothing, architect of none of it and casualty of all of it, stood up on legs that barely held him and stepped aside. The jade ring was still on the silver tray, still in Elena's hands, still waiting. The jade ring was the oldest thing in the room. It had passed through 4 generations of the Kang bloodline, through hands that had built, destroyed, bled, and occasionally done all 3 simultaneously before breakfast. It was carved from a single piece of imperial green jade, banded in black gold, and engraved on the inner face with a single Chinese character that translated, depending on your philosophical mood, as either legacy or debt. The Kang family had always privately believed the two words meant the same thing. Elena had been holding it for 53 minutes. Her arms had not moved. Her expression had not moved. If the tray had been wired to a seismograph, the reading would have been flatter than the ambitions of everyone in this room who was not currently standing in a triplet. Dae-jung turned to face her now, fully, deliberately, in the manner of a man settling a conversation that had been running in silence for 20 years. Elena met his gaze with the same quality of stillness she brought to everything, the kind that isn't emptiness, but its precise opposite, a fullness so complete it requires no movement to express itself. "You knew," he said. It was not an accusation. It was barely even a question. It was the tone of a man identifying a fact and deciding how to hold it. "I suspected," Elena said. "For 11 years. I knew for certain for one." The room processed this. 11 years. The syndicate members exchanged the microscopic glances of people recalibrating enormous amounts of information simultaneously. Minhee's jaw tightened by a fraction that only someone watching very closely would catch. Ji-hoon was watching the floor with the focused intensity of a man who had decided the floor was the only safe place left to look. "Why didn't you come to me?" Dae-jung asked. "With what?" Elena replied. And there was no challenge in it, only the plain geometry of the problem as she had lived it. "Suspicion doesn't move a man like you. You needed proof. So I waited until I had it." This was, Dae-jung understood, the most sophisticated form of loyalty he had ever encountered. Not the loud kind. Not the declarations and the pledges and the theatrical gestures that men in this business confused for devotion. The quiet kind. The kind that costs something every single day for a decade and asks for nothing in return except the chance to eventually be useful in the way that actually matters. He looked at the ring on the tray. Then he looked at his sons. Jae-won was watching him with an expression that had evolved subtly since they entered. The iron composure was still there, but beneath it something had shifted. Some frequency had changed, the way a room changes when a window is opened and air that has been still for too long finally moves. He was 25 years old, and he had grown up in a Swiss boarding school knowing two things with absolute certainty: that his mother had sent him there to keep him safe, and that his father had let her. He had constructed his understanding of Kang Dae-jung from those two facts alone, which meant his understanding had been, at best, incomplete, and at worst, the architecture of a grievance that now needed to be renovated. He was doing that renovation in real time. It showed faintly in the set of his mouth. Jae-min beside him was less contained. He had always been the one in whom the feeling moved closer to the surface. Not weakness, never weakness, but a kind of emotional velocity that the other two had learned to calibrate themselves against the way sailors calibrate against wind. He was looking at his father with the focused, complicated attention of someone trying to solve a problem that has both a mathematical and a human answer and cannot decide which one to work with first. Jae-seo had turned his gaze back to Elena. "The letters," he said. It was the first time he had spoken since they entered. His voice was quieter than his brother's, measured, deliberate. Each word placed with the care of someone who has learned that what you say can be retrieved, but what you've said cannot. "You sent 3. "I did," Elena said. "The third one had a photograph." "It did." "Of you." "Yes." Jae-seo studied her for a moment. "Why did you include yourself?" Elena considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Around them, the room continued its suspended animation. Nobody apparently willing to interrupt what had revealed itself as a separate, private conversation happening inside the larger catastrophe. A conversation that somehow carried more weight than all the drama surrounding it. "Because I wanted you to know," she said finally, "that there was someone in this house who was on your side before you arrived, so that when you walked through that door, you wouldn't feel entirely alone." The silence that followed was a different quality from all the silences that had preceded it. Those had been tense, held-breath silences. The silence of people bracing. This one was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name in the language of criminal enterprises and power transitions, because it belonged to a different vocabulary entirely. Jae-seo nodded once. A single, slow nod that bore a striking resemblance to the nod Elena had given his father 20 minutes ago, which was either coincidence or evidence that certain gestures are carried in blood. Dae-jung had watched this exchange. He turned back to Elena now. and something in his face had shifted. Not softened. The dragon did not soften, but adjusted. The way a very precise instrument adjusts when it receives new and accurate data. "Where is Ryu now?" he said. This question was not directed at anyone specific. It was directed at the room, at the infrastructure of intelligence and surveillance that kept his empire operational. But it was Nara who answered, stepping forward from her position near the east wall, where she had been standing with the focused composure of a woman who had spent the last month preparing for exactly this moment, and was not about to waste it by being invisible when her name should be spoken. "Busan," she said. "I have his location, his movements for the last 6 weeks, and the financial trail connecting him to Minhee going back to the year Ji-hoon was born." She paused. "All of it documented. All of it clean." Dae-jung looked at her. "How long have you had this?" "Completely? 3 weeks." She met his gaze without flinching. "I wanted to be certain before Successor Day. I didn't want to give you almost proof. I wanted to give you proof." The dragon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You and Elena coordinated." It was not a question. Nara glanced at Elena. Elena looked at the ring on her tray. The ghost of something crossed her face that in any other context might have been called amusement. "We had coffee," Elena said. Dae-jung turned back to his sons. To Jae-won specifically, because the eldest always receives the first question whether he wants it or not. "You came here today to claim what's yours," he said. "I'm asking you now, in front of everyone in this room, whether you came prepared to hold it." Jae-won looked at his father for a long moment. The renovation happening behind his eyes completed itself quietly, without ceremony. "We came prepared for everything," he said. Dae-jung reached out and picked up the jade ring from Elena's tray. The room stopped breathing again. The jade ring sat in Dae-jung's palm like a question he had been avoiding for 25 years. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he almost lost without knowing it was gone, with the specific, quiet devastation of retroactive understanding. Every ceremony he had imagined for this moment, every version of Successor Day he had constructed in his mind across 2 decades, had contained the wrong son. He had been rehearsing the wrong ending. The ring had been waiting, patient as stone, for the correct hand. The room was still holding its breath. Minhee was not. She exhaled, sharply once, and it was the most honest sound she had made in 25 years. It arrived with the energy of a woman who had calculated every contingency except the one currently unfolding in front of her, and had now arrived at the outer edge of her considerable capacity for controlled performance. Something behind her eyes was moving differently. The architecture of her composure was still standing, technically, but the foundation had cracked through, and anyone looking carefully enough could see the whole structure leaning. She had one play left. Dae-jung. She used his name deliberately. Not boss, not the formal address. His name. The weapon of intimacy deployed by people who have run out of formal ammunition. She crossed the room toward him with the practiced grace of someone who had navigated this space for 2 decades, who knew every sightline and every power dynamic, and exactly how to move through both. "Whatever those papers say, whatever these men claim, think about what you're doing. Ji-hoon has been here. Ji-hoon has worked for you. He has bled for this family, for this empire. You would throw away 25 years because of a DNA test?" She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to be intimate, far enough to be safe. "I gave you a son," she said. Quieter now, the razor wrapped in velvet. "I gave you an heir when you had nothing but grief in an empty penthouse. Whatever mistakes were made, whatever Ryu may have, I was here. I stayed." It was an extraordinary speech. It was, by any technical measure, the best argument available to her. Leaning into the emotional debt of presence, of consistency, of the 25 years she had occupied the space Soo-yeon had left. It was the argument of someone who understood that legitimacy can sometimes be constructed from duration alone, that people confuse staying with belonging. The room felt it. Some of the syndicate members, the older ones, the ones who remembered the dragon's grief, who had watched Minhee manage the household and manage the man through years of cold efficiency, shifted almost imperceptibly. Almost. Dae-jung listened to all of it. Then he said, "You're describing the service of a woman who loved her family. I'm looking at the record of an operative who was sent to destroy mine." The distinction settled over her like a verdict. "Those," he continued, "are not the same woman, and I will not confuse them to make this easier for either of us." Minhee stood very still. "Ryu sent you?" Dae-jung said. not asking, confirming, for the room, what her silence had already admitted. He sent you 6 months after Su-Yun died because he knew I was vulnerable and because he had the patience to wait for the right wound. He gave you a script, and you performed it for 25 years. He paused. You were very good. I want you to know I understand exactly how good you were. It was the most frightening compliment anyone in the room had ever witnessed, because it contained no anger. Anger would have been manageable. Minhee had contingencies for his anger. She had none for this. The dragon assessing her performance with the cold professional appreciation of one strategist acknowledging another, without a single degree of personal feeling left in the evaluation. She had been reduced, in his eyes, to a tactic that had run its course. Ji-hoon stood up, not with authority. That ship had not merely sailed, but had sunk, been recovered, and sunk again. He stood with the particular desperate energy of a man who has been silent through his own dismantling and has finally calculated that silence is no longer protecting him. I didn't know, he said. His voice cracked on the second word, and he pushed through it. I didn't know what she was, what he was. I didn't know any of it. He looked at Dae-jung, and whatever performance he had been attempting dissolved entirely, leaving something raw and unpolished and almost real. I thought you were my father. I thought that was true. I thought... I know, Dae-jung said. Ji-hoon stopped. You didn't choose this, the dragon said. There was no warmth in it, but there was something, the precise, reluctant acknowledgement of a man who has enough integrity to separate guilt from inheritance. You were placed here the same way my sons were placed in Switzerland, as pieces on someone else's board. He studied Ji-hoon for a moment. That doesn't make you innocent, but it makes you less culpable than the people who moved you. He turned to Minhee. It makes you considerably more culpable than everyone else in this room. Minhee said nothing. The ivory dress had never looked less like victory. Now Dae-jung turned back to his sons, Jae-won, Jae-min, Jae-seo, standing in the light with their father's face and their mother's courage and 25 years of distance between them in this moment. He looked at them and felt something shift in his chest that had no name in the vocabulary of criminal enterprise, something that belonged entirely to the other life, the secret life, the one Su-yun had carried and protected, and finally, through Elena's careful hands, delivered back to him. He looked down at the ring. Then he looked up at Jae-won. Before we go any further, because this story is about what happens when a calculated lie meets 25 years of patience from women who simply refuse to let the truth stay buried, ask yourself honestly, is there a Minhee in your life? Someone who stayed long enough that you confused their presence for loyalty? Drop it in the comments. And if you believe that blood and truth will always outlast a beautiful lie, hit subscribe, because only the Minhees of this world would scroll past without one. He extended his hand. The ring caught the light between them, green and ancient, and absolutely certain of where it belonged. And Kang Jae-won, firstborn son of the dragon and Su-yun, reached out and accepted the weight of everything his family had built, lost, hidden, and finally reclaimed. His fingers closed around it. In the east window, Minhee closed her eyes. It was the first completely honest thing she had done in 25 years. The ring on Jae-won's finger changed the temperature of the room. Not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. The syndicate members, those 12 carefully calibrated survivors of Seoul's most unforgiving industry, underwent a visible, physical recalibration. Spine straightened, shoulders adjusted. Eyes that had been watching with cautious neutrality sharpened into something more deliberate, more committed. The way eyes change when a decision has been made for them by circumstances and they've accepted the outcome with professional efficiency. This was how power transferred in rooms like this one. Not with speeches, not with votes, with a ring and a silence, and the collective decision of dangerous people to align themselves with whoever was now pointing in the direction they needed to go. Jae-won felt the shift. He had grown up outside this world, had studied it only through the letters his mother had left. She had written him 22 letters before she died, sealed in envelopes marked with dates, to be opened one per year, and through the anonymous correspondence that had begun 8 weeks ago and rearranged his entire existence. But he had Dae-jung's instincts in his blood whether he'd earned them through experience or not, and those instincts told him clearly, the room has moved. Now you move with it. He turned to face the syndicate. I don't expect your loyalty today, he said. His voice carried without effort. Another inheritance, that projection, that natural command frequency that made rooms lean in rather than away. Loyalty isn't something you hand to a man because he's wearing a ring. I know that. My father knows that. He glanced at Dae-jung briefly, the first time he had used that word aloud in this room, and the word cost him something small and private that only Jae-min and Jae-seo, standing beside him, were close enough to see. What I'm asking for today is time, a reasonable interval in which to demonstrate that the blood in this ring is the same blood that built what you've all spent your careers protecting. One of the senior syndicate members, a compact, silver-haired man named Huang, who had been with the dragon since the Itaewon years, and whose silence typically carried more authority than most men's speeches, tilted his head by precisely 3 degrees. "And your brothers?" he said. "What role?" Jae-won didn't hesitate. "Equal partners in leadership. 3 heads, 1 direction. We've been making decisions together since we were 8 years old. We're not going to stop now because we've acquired a penthouse." Huang studied all 3 of them for a long moment, with the assessment of a man who has evaluated a great number of people over a great number of years and has developed both an efficient methodology and a near-perfect accuracy rate. Then he nodded. 4 degrees this time, which, for Huang, was essentially a standing ovation. The other syndicate members followed, not with enthusiasm, not yet, but with a measured, professional acknowledgement of people who recognize a legitimate transfer when they witness one. One by one. Deliberate. The old world stepping aside for the new one with the careful dignity of people who understand that grace in transition is its own form of power. Throughout all of this, Minhee had not moved from her position near the window. She stood with her back half turned to the room, looking out over Seoul. 62 floors of city spread beneath her, the Han River catching light in the distance, the ordered chaos of a metropolis that had never once adjusted its pace for anyone's personal catastrophe. The city looked exactly as it had this morning when she'd arrived, believing she was about to complete the longest mission of her life. It looked entirely indifferent to the fact that the mission was now rubble. Ji-hoon stood 10 feet away from her, and the distance between them, mother and son, or the people who had occupied those roles, felt considerably larger than 10 feet. He had not approached her since Dae-jung's assessment of them both. He was processing, in the slow and shell-shocked manner of someone who has discovered that the foundational story of their entire existence was authored by someone else, that the life they inhabited was a stage set, that the father they mourned not having was actually the rival of the man they'd been raised to replace. It was, by any measure, a difficult Tuesday. Nara moved through the room toward Elena, who had finally lowered the silver tray, now empty, the ring having found its rightful hand, and set it on the sideboard with the quiet finality of a task completed after an extraordinarily long time. "You all right?" Nara said quietly. "I've been all right for 20 years, Elena replied. "I'm simply more visibly all right than usual today." Nara almost smiled. "What happens to her?" She didn't gesture toward Minhee. She didn't need to. Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the room with those steady, observant eyes that had cataloged 2 decades of this household's truths and lies and everything in between. "That," she said, "depends on what she does in the next 10 minutes. Across the room, as if she had heard, and perhaps she had, because Minhee had survived 25 years in a den of predators by developing hearing that bordered on supernatural. Minhee turned from the window. She looked at Ji-hoon first. Something crossed her face that was too complicated and too genuine to be performance. A flicker of the real thing. Whatever the real thing was for a woman who had been performing for so long that the layers had compressed into something almost indistinguishable from a self. She looked at him the way a person looks when they're trying to locate the version of an event in which they were not entirely the villain, and finding the search more difficult than anticipated. Then she looked at Dae-young. He was standing with his sons, the 4 of them in a loose configuration that was not yet comfort, but was no longer distance. Something tentative and structural taking shape between them. The scaffolding of a relationship being constructed from materials that had been manufactured elsewhere and were now being assembled for the first time. Dae-jung said something low to Jae-min, who responded, and something shifted in the dragon's face. That crack from earlier widening almost imperceptibly, almost warmly. Minhee watched this and understood, with the cold clarity of someone built for assessment, that she had failed at the one thing that would have made all 25 years worth something. She had never once made him look like that. She had kept him. She had managed him. She had maneuvered him with extraordinary precision. But she had never, not once, made Kang Dae-jung's face do what it was doing right now. She straightened her spine. smoothed the front of her ivory dress, and walked toward him with the measured steps of a woman who has decided, at the absolute end of all available options, to try the one move she had never once in her adult life attempted. The truth. Min-hee stopped 2 feet from Dae-jung and waited until he turned to face her. He did, unhurried, complete, giving her the full weight of his attention the way he gave everything his full attention. Because Kang Dae-jung had never once in his life done anything halfway, including listening to the woman who had spent 25 years dismantling him from the inside. His son stepped back slightly, not from deference, but from the instinctive recognition that what was about to happen belonged to a conversation older than their presence in this room. Min-hee looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I was 19 when Ryu found me." Nobody moved. My family owed him money. The kind of debt that doesn't come with a payment plan. It comes with a list of options, and none of them are options. She said this without self-pity, which made it considerably more devastating than self-pity would have been. He told me what he needed. He told me exactly who you were, what you'd lost, what you'd be looking for in the months after your wife died. He told me to be that thing. She paused. I was 19 years old, and I was afraid, and I said yes. The room absorbed this. I want to be precise, she continued, because I think precision is the only thing I have left that's worth anything. I came here as Ryu's instrument. That is true. Ji-hoon was conceived as a strategic placement. That is also true. Her eyes didn't leave Dae-jung's face. What is equally true, and what I have never said aloud to anyone including myself, is that somewhere in the middle of 25 years, I stopped being his instrument and started being something else. Something without a clean name. Something that wanted the life I was pretending to have and couldn't have it, because it was built on a lie I couldn't dismantle without destroying everything, including myself. The silence was the listening kind. I didn't send for your sons, she said. I didn't expose myself. I didn't hand you the proof. I wasn't brave enough for any of that. She glanced, briefly, just once, at Elena. Other people were braver than me. I'm aware of that. I'm not here to claim credit for a courage I didn't demonstrate. She looked back at Dae-jung. I'm here because I owe you a true thing, and this is the last room I'll ever stand in, with the right to offer you one, and I didn't want to leave it having given you nothing real in 25 years. Dae-jung studied her for a very long time. Outside, Seoul continued its indifferent, magnificent business. 62 floors below, the city moved and breathed and conducted its 10,000 simultaneous dramas without pausing for any single one of them. The Han River caught the afternoon light and threw it back at the sky. Somewhere in Itaewon, in a neighborhood that had once produced a boy with nothing but hunger and will, someone was building something from scratch and didn't know yet whether it would become an empire or a footnote. Where is Ryu now? Dae-jung asked. This time the question was directed at her specifically. Min-hee reached into the small clutch she had carried all morning, the ivory one, perfectly matched, the final prop of the performance she was now dismantling piece by piece, and produced a folded piece of paper. She held it out. He took it, unfolded it, read it. A location, a schedule, movement patterns for the next 72 hours, detailed with the specificity of someone who had been paying close attention for a very long time and had decided, at the absolute last available moment, to pay that attention in a different direction. Nara, standing near the sideboard, watched Dae-jung read the paper and recognized, with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years mapping financial networks, that what Min-hee had just handed over was not an apology. It was a key. Dae-jung folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, and said, "Take Ji-hoon and leave Seoul. Both of you. Tonight." Min-hee blinked. It was the first involuntary thing her face had done all morning. "That's all?" she said. "You gave me something real," he said. "I'm giving you something real in return. A head start." His voice dropped half a register, carrying the specific, quiet weight of a final warning from a man whose final warnings were not delivered twice. "Don't mistake it for forgiveness, and don't be in this city when I'm finished with Ryu." Min-hee nodded. She turned to Ji-hoon, who had been listening from 10 feet away with the expression of someone who had spent the last 2 hours having his entire identity surgically removed and was only now beginning to understand that what remained underneath might be survivable. She crossed to him, stopped in front of him, and for a moment she was simply a mother in front of her son, not a strategist, not an operative, not a 25-year lie in an ivory dress, Just a woman looking at the one part of the last quarter century that had been genuinely, uncomplicatedly hers. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Not for having you. Never for that. But for the world I placed you in without your consent." Jihoon looked at her for a long time. Then he said, roughly, unevenly, with the voice of someone building a sentence out of materials that don't quite fit together yet, "We'll figure the rest out later." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the door left open for it, which is where forgiveness always begins. They left together. The room watched them go without ceremony. No guards, no escort, no dramatic punctuation. Just two people walking out of a life that had never entirely belonged to them, into the uncertain, unscripted territory of whatever came next. The oak doors closed behind them. Daejung turned back to his sons, Jae-won, Jae-min, Jae-seo, standing in a room that was now theirs, wearing a legacy that had waited 25 years to find them, carrying their mother's courage and their father's blood, and the particular unbreakable quality of people who have been kept from something long enough to understand exactly what it's worth. Daejung looked at them. Really looked. The way he hadn't permitted himself to in the chaos of the last 2 hours. And something in his face completed the journey it had begun when the doors first opened. The crack widened into something that was not weakness, but its opposite. The specific strength of a man who has finally stopped holding something at arm's length and is allowing it, after 25 years, to be close. "Your mother," he said, and his voice was different now, stripped of the dragon entirely, carrying only the man underneath, "wrote you letters." Jae-won nodded carefully. 22 of them. "She wrote me one," Daejung said. "The night she left. I've read it every year since she died." He was quiet for a moment. "She said that if she couldn't bring you back herself, she trusted the world to find a way. She said the truth always travels slowly, but it always arrives." He looked at Elena, across the room. Elena, who had been the world's instrument in this, who had been the mechanism by which Soo-yeon's trust had proven itself justified. Elena inclined her head. Small. Precise. The gesture of a woman who has completed a 20-year assignment and is now quietly exhaling. Daejung looked back at his sons. "She was right," he said simply. As usual, Jae-min, the one in whom the feeling moved closest to the surface, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite the alternative, but lived in the complicated territory between them. Jae-seo placed a hand briefly on his brother's shoulder. Jae-won looked at his father with those obsidian eyes and said nothing. Because nothing was precisely the right response. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because it is already full. Daejung extended his hand. Not the ring hand. That moment had passed, had been given, was done. His other hand. Open. Offered with the straightforward simplicity of a man who has run out of complicated gestures and is trying, perhaps for the first time in his life, a simple one. Jae-won looked at it, looked at his father, and shook it. Firm, deliberate, the grip of someone accepting a beginning rather than a conclusion. Then Jae-min took it. Then Jae-seo. 4 hands, 1 bloodline. 25 years folded into a moment that lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained approximately everything. Nara, standing beside Elena at the sideboard, said very quietly, "Is this the part where it's over?" Elena considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "This," she said, watching the dragon and his sons begin the slow, imperfect, necessary work of becoming a family, "is the part where it starts." Outside, Seoul moved. The Han River ran. 62 floors below, the city conducted its business with magnificent indifference to the fact that in a penthouse above it, a dead woman's love had just outlasted a living woman's lies, that patience had defeated strategy, that truth had arrived slowly and on schedule, and that 3 boys who had grown up eating Swiss boarding school porridge were now the most dangerous heirs in the Korean underworld. The jade ring caught the last of the afternoon light on Jae-won's finger. Green. Ancient. Exactly where it had always been going. The dragon's empire didn't fall that day. It simply, finally, came home.